Welcome everyone, thank you so much for coming. And I'm now going to run you through a presentation. It's not that long, and I'm going to try and simplify everything for you and give you specific examples about what can and can't be labelled as made in the UK and what the rules of origin, as they call it, what they actually are. So, welcome to my presentation on can I label my products made in the UK. So, what are we going to cover today? Well, firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about the rules, and there are several different versions of the rules. So I'm going to cover what they are and try and clarify that and simplify that for you. We're also going to talk about what percentage of a product has to be made here in order for it to qualify. One of the things that we're also going to cover is whether the raw materials have to come from the UK or not, which is a hot topic, and I know it's one of the issues that lots of people have in understanding the country of origin rules. We're also going to have examples of what can and can't be labelled as made in the UK. So I've got some specific examples for you, and also whether you have to label a product with its country of origin. So firstly, the government guidelines. Now I've put a link for you there to the government's website for where you can find the country of origin or the rules of origin guidelines, but actually I wouldn't bother reading them. I've summarised it here because they're pretty vague on what they actually say, but there are two main categories that come within the rules. And the first one is goods that are wholly obtained or produced in a single country. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And the second one is goods where the production involves materials from more than one country. And that is where it does get slightly complicated. And currently, because we're in the EU, we follow the EU rules. And I'm also going to run you through the minefield that is the EU rules on the rules of origin. So to show you the difference of the two different types of whether wholly obtained here or not wholly obtained, firstly, I've got you an example. So the classic and wonderful traditional Fair Isle jumper. Now, if it uses wool that's come from a British sheep, yarn that's spun in Yorkshire, and then that yarn is knitted into a fantastic sweater in Scotland, then that product is wholly produced in the UK. Its raw materials have come from the UK. They've either grown in the UK, they've been harvested in the UK. It's 100% British or UK made. Now that's a really, really simple one. And for the real purists among you, that is a truly 100% British product. However, it's not the only type of product that is classified as made in the UK. So let's go on to what type 2 is, which is, got an example here, which is a printed dress. So say that this particular dress, the cotton is grown and spun and the fabric is woven in India. Then maybe that fabric travels to Turkey where it's dyed and then printed. Then the fabric comes into the UK and it's stitched at a factory in London. Now that is obviously not wholly produced in the UK because the separate parts of it are actually coming from several different countries. Now that can be labelled as made in the UK, and I'll go through the reasons as to why later on. So the World Trade Organization is actually the organisation where the definition originally comes from of rules of origin, and even they on their website, and I have again put the link to their website there, even they are quite vague about the rules, what the rules actually are. In fact, in this statement here, as you can see, if you read that, it does say that generally the substantial transformation, that's a bit of a tongue twister, the substantial transformation is what is universally recognised as whether something can be made here. And I will talk to you about what substantial transformation actually means in a minute. But also other countries use change of tariff classification, the percentage criterion, and also the criterion of the manufacturing or processing operation. So if I've confused you, I hope I'm going to simplify it in a minute, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned what the World Trade Organization rules are, because if you do export, you want to be aware of them. And again, I've put a link there to the World Trade Organization's website. So if you fancy some further reading and some homework on this and really want to dig into this, then go to that. But I'm going to now try and simplify it for you. So the EU, which is at the moment the rules that we follow in the UK, now they say, according to the EU protocol on the rules of origin, that there are 3 main criteria. And if your product fits one of them, then that defines where the country of origin of your product comes from. So firstly, they have what's called the value added rule. And I'll show you, I have a formula for that. So for those of you that do like maths, we've got a value added formula, which I've simplified for you. You've also then got the specific operations rule, which applies to certain types of products. And I've got an example for that for you as well. And also the change of tariff classification, which in other words is known as the substantial transformation rule. So what do all of those mean? Firstly, the value added rule. Now this is what they say on the EU website. Value added shall be taken to be the X works price minus the customs value of each of the materials incorporated which originate in the other countries. And what does that look like as a formula? So if you want to work out how the value added formula actually works, what it looks at is the cost of the materials that you import and then how much value you add on them in the UK. And there is actually a formula that you can use to work that out, which means you take your ex factory price, which is where, or the price when it leaves you and when you sell it on to your customer, minus the cost of the raw materials, divided by the cost of the raw materials, times by 100. I'm taking everyone back to their GCSE maths here. But if you do that, you get the percentage of value that you have added at your factory. And generally, but not always, because it wouldn't be that simple, would it? But generally, that's seen as being about 40 to 50%. So you need to add on at least half of the value in the country that you want to label the products as. So I've actually even worked you out a formula there. Say you buy in some raw materials from overseas for £10. You then process it in your factory, or your factory processes it for you and sells it to you at £30. Using that formula, you have added on 200%. So you've easily added on enough to the value. But like I say, that is one of the EU formulas. It is what's used if you're exporting products from the EU to another country. You do need to use that formula when you export. And also if you're in the UK and you're exporting to the EU, currently you don't have to pay the duty if you're making it in the EU, if your raw materials are from the EU. So the second rule that they use is the specific operations rule. This method dictates specific production processes that may confer originating status to the goods. Now, what does that mean? Now, in the UK, we've got a really good example of this, which is our ceramics industry. Because a while ago, a rule was actually passed by, well, it was to protect the ceramics industry in Stoke, which said that their specific process was the first firing had to happen in Stoke-on-Trent. So, and they did this to protect ceramics that weren't being made in the UK. So we have a big ceramics industry. We had a very big one in the UK originally in Stoke. And when a lot of those companies moved over to other countries to manufacture, what they were doing, they were importing the ceramics which they were making overseas and then just adding a decoration or the glazing here in the UK. And oh dear, I think I've stopped sharing there. What happened there? Oh, no, I am still sharing. I've closed the screens down. Sorry about that. So yeah, so what right, so start again. So Stoke, what they did to protect the authenticity and the provenance of their products made in Stoke and their ceramics made in Stoke, that they said you have to have done the first firing in Stoke, and they passed a law. So that is how they specified the production process for ceramics to be able to call them made in the UK, which actually makes that really simple. If it's not fired, had its first firing in Stoke, then you can't call it made in the UK. But unfortunately, it's not as simple with many different other product types. I wish it was, and maybe one day it will, but currently that's one of the main products that it refers to, and there aren't many others. Correct me if anyone knows something else where that's the case, but I don't think so. And the final rule is the change of tariff classification. So that is when a product is substantially changed to the point that it requires a different classification. Sorry, that's my cat scratching away in the background, making a terrible racket. So that's when a product is substantially changed to the point that requires a different classification. Of the three methods, this is generally the method used when exporting or importing goods. So what does this substantially changed actually mean? So as an example, and one of the clearest examples is raw material versus finished product. So if you have leather and its product classification is leather, when you turn that leather into a bag, its classification then becomes a leather bag. It has a different end use, and that's the easiest way of thinking about it. Before, it's the skin of a cow. Afterwards, it's something you carry your products around in. So it's completely different end use, and it has a different classification. Not always that simple, but I'm going to give you some examples. So what we generally use in the UK still, and what we use as Make It British, is the Trading Standards Act from 1969. So for want of any other method, that has become standard procedure, shall we say, and because everything else is so confusing, the rule that everyone still uses is the Trading Standards Act from 1968, which says, goods shall be deemed to have been manufactured or produced in the country in which they last underwent a treatment or process resulting in a substantial change. And until we have a new act or a new law, this is the one that most people adhere to. So what does that actually look like when it comes to real life? Well, this is where I have a little bit of a quiz for you and a little bit of a challenge. So I can see you're all quite active in the chat. So I'm going to give you some examples. And what I want you to do is say yay or nay, yes or no. Do you think it can be labelled as made in the UK based on the substantial change and where the substantial change took place? Right, are you ready? I can see, actually, just going back, while you're all getting ready to write in the chat, Shona Walker has made a very good point in that Harris Tweed is also protected. So that's very true, Shona. Thank you very much. That's a great example. Right, are you ready? Let's go on to our quiz. So, and don't forget, if you do have a specific product of your own, and I don't cover it as one of the examples here, then please do write in the Q&A. I can see a few people have written something already, and I will cover those specific products at the end. So firstly, we've got high top vans. So let's say something, well, a well-known branded high top van, which is from a company that's not British owned. So the company is not British owned. The parts are imported from overseas. So maybe things like the engine, a lot of the moving parts, even some of the bodywork maybe. It's then assembled in a production line in England, and it's sprayed and finished here in the UK as well. So what are your thoughts on that? Who's saying yes? Who's saying no? Julie says yes. James says no. I can see the majority of you are saying yes. I'll wait for a few more people to give their responses. Well, I can say that the majority of you are correct. Yes, that van can be called made in the UK because the substantial change that took place was when it was assembled in England. So before that, it was a whole group of different parts. You couldn't drive around in it, and you might have something that's an engine, you might have, all the different bits. Once it's assembled together, that is the substantial change, and that is what defines that as being made in the UK. And for instance, Vauxhall, make some of their vans in the UK, and they do label and promote them as such, even though a lot of the parts come from elsewhere in Europe. Right, brilliant. That was well done. What about the next one? So we've got a diamond ring. Now the diamond might have been mined from somewhere in Africa. Maybe the gold that it was used to mount it in was from outside the UK as well. But the diamond was actually set in the UK, and then it was sold as a wonderful engagement ring to someone. What do people think there? Yes or no? Oh, you're all doing well. You're doing very well. Right, okay, so that ring, yes, that can also be labelled as made in the UK. And the reason is, when the jeweller went about setting that diamond in the UK, they made a substantial change. Before that, it was a precious stone and it was a piece of metal. So it was the process in which they set it in the UK. And actually what I could have added on there is that the ring was designed in the UK, but had they set that diamond, designed it here and then set it outside of the UK again, that wouldn't have counted, because the design process doesn't count. It has to be the actual point of a substantial change that physically happened to that product. Right, next one. I've probably already given you a clue on this one, so let's see who was listening. So if you've got a mug that's printed in the UK, maybe the clay comes from overseas. The first firing is maybe done somewhere like Thailand, but the transfer on it is applied in the UK. What do we think about that? I think everyone's got that right. That is correct. Not British, even though it's got a Union Jack on it. And don't ever be fooled by the Union Jack. That's what I call fake it British. Having a Union Jack on it does not mean it's British or made in the UK. And that is because when the first firing of that mug was done overseas, then that's where the substantial change took place. Right, have we got anyone here that makes furniture? I've got an example here of an upholstered chair. So say the parts of this chair are made outside of the UK. It's assembled overseas, but the cloth that's used for it is made here. It's cut and stitched and upholstered here in the UK. So it's covered here in the UK, but the frame of it is not from the UK. Now, this one is slightly more ambiguous and more tricky. So what is everyone's thoughts on this one? I think we're split about 50-50 on this. Right, okay. So those that said it wasn't made in the UK were correct. And that is because when the chair was assembled overseas, that's when it turned into the sum of its parts, so fabric, metal legs, whatever makes up the body of the chair, to when you could actually sit on it, and when it became usable as a chair, actually didn't happen in the UK. So that is just finished in the UK. So well done to everyone that got that one right. Now, this is probably the one I get asked more than anything else, and it's about the printed t-shirt. So if you've got a t-shirt, or any item that's printed, maybe this t-shirt, the fabric is knitted overseas. You've also had the cloth cut and stitched, maybe somewhere like China, but you've put the print on the front. So maybe it's some substantial decoration has gone onto the front of it. Maybe it's embellished here, printed here. You've sewn the label on in the UK. What do we think about that one? You're all getting the hang of this now. The answers are coming through really quick. Now, I think that's pretty much a resounding no from everyone. So you get it. Brilliant. Yeah, that is correct. A t-shirt that's just printed here is still a t-shirt that's made in China. It's just printed in the UK, because the substantial change took place in China when it was cut and stitched. It was a t-shirt when it left China, when it got imported into the UK, and it just became a printed t-shirt once it was here at the factory here. So I think this is now my final one, a pair of shoes. Have we got anyone here from the footwear industry? Because I know this is always a very hot debate amongst the purists in Northampton, where we still make a lot of shoes. So the leather may be tanned overseas, and many footwear factories do actually stitch their uppers in India. The soles themselves may have been made in China, but in the UK, they will last the shoe, which is when they shape it. and they will add that sole and finish it in the UK, finish it in England, even finish it in Northampton. What do we think about that? I can see someone put depressingly yes. Yeah, that is true. You can, because the different parts, even if all the different parts were made overseas, and sometimes there's a reason for that. Maybe there's no one that makes those particular molded soles or heels in the UK. You have to import those parts. You may have stitched the uppers overseas, but if the lasting and finishing is done here, only at that point does it become a shoe that is a shoe that you can actually wear. Now, if anyone that knows the Northampton footwear industry or knows the British shoe industry, there is very much two groups within Northampton of those that import their uppers, and generally their brogues might retail for £200 or so. And then those who stitch their uppers here, which is called closing, which is the stitching, and do the lasting and finishing here. And those sorts of brogues probably retail maybe for more like 300, 350 plus. And those are seen as the really pure made in Northampton, made in England shoes. But whereas you can actually label those that have the parts separately. So for instance, New Balance trainers, they make a lot of trainers in the UK, but they often stitch the uppers overseas and just do the joining together here. Right, so well done, everyone. I think we pretty much got everyone was pretty much spot on, particularly by the end. You've all got the hang of it. So I hope that's helped you understand some of the basic principles about whether you can label a product as made in the UK or not. Now, the question you need to ask yourself about your product is, does it have the same end use before this process was carried out? That's one of the easiest ways of defining it. So for instance, with the shoes, can you walk around with them before or after? So if it's just a pair of shoes that's hand finished, polished, painted here, but they're actually connected together, if you could wear them as a pair of shoes before they arrived in the UK, then you can't. So I'd love to hear about some of your specific products. Now's the time to start putting your questions in the Q&A if you have a specific product that you want to ask me about. While you're doing that, I just want to define some of the things as well that most definitely don't count, but which you will see people use in order to try and give people the impression, what I call fake it British, give people the impression that they're making a product here. And they do that because there's a real value to having a made in the UK label on a product. And that is the problem. People know that if someone sees made in the UK written on something, they will pay a little bit more for it. They expect it to be quality. It's that stamp of, genuine provenance of having made in the UK. So unfortunately, there are some people that will try and mislead people into thinking something is made here. And some of the phrases and the things that are used are designed in the UK. So it can be designed anywhere, but if it's not actually produced here, then it doesn't count. But you will see people, it's for instance with Apple, they use that on their iPhones, don't they? Does it say designed in California, but made in China? So still made in China. Another one that's slightly more tricky is developed in the UK. And usually that means that maybe the sample process or the initial prototypes, take Dyson, for instance, with his Hoovers. I think he uses that one, developed in the UK or engineered in the UK as well. Might mean that it was developed here, but it doesn't actually mean that the production for the full-on mass production was actually done here. The other thing is whether a company is British owned or not. Now, again, the purists would say you need to be a British owned company with materials that have grown or been harvested here in the UK, and you need to make it here in the UK. That would be a truly British product. But unfortunately, a lot of our biggest UK manufacturers, for instance, the car industry, sadly are no longer British owned. It doesn't mean they can't call it made in the UK, but some people do have their preferences to actually prefer to buy from companies which are British owned as well. And also that old trick with just putting labels on here or some fancy packaging or maybe a bit of decoration. I don't see so many examples of that happening now, but yeah, it does still go on. And if anyone does know about any of this fake it British stuff going on, always let me know. Let us know here at Make It British. So thank you very much for joining me. Keep on making in the UK. and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Take care.